Ali Khan was like his father, the Aga Khan, all over again, but the old Aga had been famous only for racehorses and an annual salary of his own weight in diamonds. Ali was famous for marrying Rita Hayworth. He was famous for succeeding with a lot of other women who were married to other men. He travelled between love affairs in a succession of fast cars. Fast were part of the Playboy pattern. Motor racing had always attracted aristocrats with time on their hands. Now the gentlemen were outstripped for glamour by the players. Juan Manuel Fangio was a dirt track racer from Argentina who emerged as a nerveless, enigmatic hero, 5 times Formula One champion of the world. Women unimpressed by their husbands' driving said, "Who do you think you are, Fangio?" In Britain they said, "Who do you think you are, Sterling Moss?" He was a brilliant driver, he was handsome, and he wowed the girls all over the world. A driver for the export drive, Britain's knight in a white helmet, he was patriotic, but he really lived in 2 countries. One of them was the fame country, and it was everywhere. Aristotle Onassis spelt self-made man in Greek. He had built his fortune during the wartime shipping shortage, renting out rusty cargo ships flying dubious flags. But nobody cared about how he made his money, because he was so spectacular about the way he spent it. Ari drew famous people into his orbit by offering hospitality too lavish to resist. Winston Churchill saved civilization. Onassis only hustled a few billion fast drachma. But Churchill came to stay on Onassis's yacht. The question of whether fame was deserved or not was ceasing to matter. Eva Peron came to fame as the wife of the most famous man in Argentina, Juan Peron, whose neo-fascist regime was found so congenial by Nazi war criminals on the run that they settled down there and learned Spanish. On the international scene, Evita's fame exceeded her husband's. The press didn't care that the money for her couture clothes had been earned by the sweat of the peasants she claimed to represent. What counted was her vitality, her glamour, and her easily told story as a woman of the people who had risen to world conquest. Evita toured Europe and laid them in the aisles. Onassis later gallantly revealed that he and Evita seduced each other within minutes of their first meeting. Mutual fame was a lot better than an introduction. It was a sort of pre-established intimacy. Fame meant the world knowing who you were, even if only an expert could understand what you did. Picasso loved being famous. Fame increased his market and put up his prices. Every American multimillionaire had to have his Picasso, even if it was only a piece of pottery. Soon Picasso was a multimillionaire too. Hardly anyone could tell a real Picasso from a fake, but it didn't matter because the real Picasso was Picasso himself. Picasso wouldn't go to Spain while Franco still lived, and Hemingway wasn't allowed to return because Franco hadn't forgotten what he'd written during the Spanish Civil War. But in 1959 the ban was lifted, and Hemingway was back there to watch the bulls bite the dust. Or else he was out in the Gulf Stream killing fish. Or else he was in Africa killing animals again. Hemingway was always killing something. He called it an appetite for life. But he no longer wrote good books, although he got the Nobel Prize after one of his worst, The Old Man and the Sea. He was an immortal while he was still alive. It no longer mattered what he wrote. He was just a great writer, the way Picasso was a great artist. Fame was a way of being that left doing far behind. Frank Sinatra had been 4F and not allowed to fight. During the war, female teenagers, called Bobby Soxers, thought he had been manufactured in heaven specifically to gratify their desires, but after the war, his career both as an actor and a singer had taken a dive. His role as Maggio in From Here to Eternity put him back on top as an actor. He came back as a singer with a series of record albums that exploited the new 33 1/3 RPM long-playing format. They gave would-be lovers everywhere a whole evening in the company of someone who seemed to share their solitude. But there was also an entirely new eminence as an international icon who was just Sinatra. Sinatra showed up all over the place with beautiful women, to some of whom he was married. He gave journalists a bad time. He could have been the biggest star in Hollywood, but he didn't seem to care. They had to get his performance in one take. He was himself. He was his own man. That was the message he sent to the world. The new Hollywood star who really cared about acting was Marlon Brando. His initial impact made all previous film stars, even the most naturalistic ones like Sinatra, look as if they had been just saying their lines. Brando conveyed what was behind the lines. He conveyed emotion, whole complexes of emotions, bottomless wells of psychic disturbance. It was called the subtext, and you knew that for Brando it meant more than the words, because you couldn't always understand the words. Brando spoke English as if it were a foreign language he had acquired by sleep teaching from a gramophone record running at the wrong speed. Brando was a wild one off-screen as well. Every publicity still the studio got Brando to do cost them a week of persuasion. But the movie moguls stopped being angry when they discovered that Brando's reluctance to be publicized resulted in more publicity than they could ever have planned. The harder he rebelled, the easier to market the rebellion. Feeling manipulated, he brooded darkly. The conflict was within. He was having a private crisis in public. He was more than a movie star. He was modern man. Modern men everywhere were influenced by him, some of them to their detriment. Far away in Tokyo, Japan's most famous writer, Yukio Mishima, had himself photographed as the Wild One, with a few slight changes to the wardrobe. Where Brando had worn boots, cap, jeans, T-shirt, and a leather jacket, Mishima, with traditional Japanese minimalism, reduced the costume to boots, cap, and a daringly cut bikini. Though he kept his clothes on, James Dean was a stronger challenger for Brando's crown as champion rebel. In only his second major screen appearance, in Rebel Without a Cause, he was such a brooding outcast he made Brando look like Danny Kaye. Dean took being young and inarticulate to new lengths. He took so long to get anything said that older people grew older still, waiting for him to spit it out. But Dean was an exceptional actor, and Hollywood knew it. He was given the mixed-up kid roles because teenagers in the drive-ins in their fathers' cars wanted to see one of their own kind who dared to defy all those pettifogging grown-up conventional inhibitions, such as bringing the car home instead of driving it off a cliff. If Dean had confined his speed mania to the racetrack, he might have stayed in one piece, but he drove the same way on the public highway, terminating his film career just as his movies were making their impact on the worshipping young. His fame kept on going, as if the car crash had stopped his body but not his soul. It was the Valentino option, frozen in motion before the luster could tarnish. Some wag called his early death a good career move, but really it put him beyond a film career. He was the famous face who stayed young. Lonely young people everywhere pinned his picture on the wall, their own angel. Elvis Presley came out of the South like an answer to a record executive's dream. Elvis sounded no more comprehensible than Marlon Brando singing in the bath, but he had a face sculpted by Michelangelo crocked on moonshine, and every move he made said sex. In his first few TV appearances, he put all the moves in. Appalled at the prospect of America's youth being corrupted by Elvis's swiveling hips, the television executives panicked. By Elvis's 10th appearance, they were shooting him strictly from the waist up. Crosby and Sinatra had been hampered in their global reach by the dependence of their songs on the English language. Presley's universally incomprehensible slur went through language barriers like a silent movie. His records sold anywhere in the world where there were young people ready to love someone their parents hated. But Elvis wanted the parents, too, or rather his manager did. Colonel Tom Parker's qualifications for running a big business were no more substantial than his military rank. He was a nickel-and-dime merchant who knew nothing about the outside world and never allowed Elvis to go on tour outside America. But Colonel Parker did think big about maximizing his boy's home market. When Elvis's draft number came up, the teenage rebel went into the army without a murmur. He proved to be a model soldier and practically became part of U.S. foreign policy. He came home to find it increased his young audience while winning over their parents. His movie career boomed too. The colonel helped him pick the scripts. There had never been anything like the Elvis experience. By the start of the 60s, music and movies had made a Memphis bumpkin into a planetary presence as inescapable as carbon dioxide. The 1960s were the 20th century's second most famous era after the 1920s. Until the 1960s, fame had progressed in step with the development of communications technology. But now, with all the technology in place up to and including a television set in the kitchen, fame suddenly broke into a run. The world's most advanced nation elected a president who looked like a film star. John Fitzgerald Kennedy was as physically attractive as Marlon Brando and a lot easier to understand. He didn't look like any previous presidential candidate. He looked more like people famous for other things: movies, upmarket sports, fooling around in the sun with beautiful women. The son of a rich Irish Catholic who had bribed and bullied his way to respectability, JFK had a background that could have worked against him, but his foreground worked for him. His own natural glamour was enhanced by strategy. During World War II, JFK's PT boat had been sunk, and he helped the crew to survive. His heroism was made part of the story. So was his perfect wife, Jackie. JFK had the sexual energy of a male fiddler crab on a spring night, but that was left out of the story. The total picture was kept simple and polished, like an airbrushed icon. In the famous television debate between Kennedy and Nixon, the experienced Nixon argued at least as well as his upstart opponent. Without the money his father poured into the campaign, Kennedy might never have drawn level with Nixon in the first place. But in the debate, it was Kennedy's glamour that put him ahead by a hair's breadth, and the hair was on Nixon's jaw. The smart money said that Nixon lost the election by the whiskers he had neglected to shave. The new president was no mere figurehead. When Khrushchev planted nuclear-tipped missiles in Cuba, Kennedy risked war by demanding their removal. Two famous men were deciding the fate of the world. The third famous man, Fidel Castro, wasn't even consulted. The missiles were in his country, but the real arena was the worldwide media. Kennedy persuaded Khrushchev to back down, and the result was interpreted as a triumph for Kennedy's character. Politics had become personalized to an unprecedented degree, at least partly because JFK was such an attractive person. Britain's fictional secret agent, James Bond, was an acknowledgement that most of Britain's factual spies had turned out to be working for the KGB. The actor Sean Connery became inextricably identified with the role. The script said that Britain had no independent power left. It was in partnership with the Americans. But Connery gave Bond a physical presence reflecting the influence that Britain would have liked to have, and the films clicked abroad because Britain actually did have a new kind of influence, a new chic based on old brand names. Bond's easy expertise about upmarket consumer goods went down a storm, with men uneasily aware that they might not be using the proper aftershave. Britain had less power than it used to, but made more news. News was more interesting than power, and scandal was the most interesting news. Britain's Secretary for War, John Profumo, became involved with a svelte courtesan called Christine Keeler. Profumo was James Bond, and Keeler was Pussy Galore. He was upper class, and she had only her looks. The suave Profumo found his Italian-sounding name permanently stuck on a very British style of media-maximized sex sensation. Britons were finding themselves so fascinating that the world was fascinated too. Peter Sellers could speak in a variety of British accents. He was a walking class system. Hollywood got interested, but couldn't quite figure out what to do with him until they made him a Frenchman. As the star of a whole series of films devoted to the adventures of the clumsy Inspector Clouseau, Sellers found himself world-famous and trapped. Richard Burton, Britain's wide-faced gift to the widescreen, starred as Mark Antony in America's mega-budget movie Cleopatra. Americans still needed Britons to play Romans. They had the right sort of accent, a kind of Latin you could understand. The movie went over the top in every way long before it was finished, and would have finished the studio if it had not been for the extra publicity earned by Burton's off-screen love affair with Elizabeth Taylor. The affair wasn't really off-screen at all. It was a media event as over-the-top as the movie, and with a budget that was only slightly smaller. Taylor was British-born, but had grown up into the American Cleopatra, in whose arms a succession of the world's most illustrious men neglected their own destinies. As an actress, she was limited to being only as good as the performance a director could extract from her. But she was protected against her limitations, and even against aging, by a media prominence that made her even more famous for being herself than for being an actress. Beyond being a film star, there was this new, bigger stardom of being just talked about all the time. Burton, on the other hand, was held up as an awful warning by those who said British people in the arts should be offering the barbarous but powerful America a cultural example. To the two people involved with each other, however, there was only one country, the Fame country, consisting mainly of luxury hotels linked by first-class flights. Burton lapped it up, yet looked haunted. He was a very long way from Wales. He was a long way from anywhere, on the way to somewhere he didn't like. Ernest Hemingway had been heading in the same direction for a long time and finally reached his destination. He could never have enough of killing living things. Finally, he did it to himself with a shotgun. He had bagged his last trophy, the one he couldn't stuff. Marilyn Monroe also wrote her own last chapter. The press carried constant stories of the drugs she took to make her sleep. The press didn't know she scarcely had time to sleep because she was having love affairs with both Jack and Bobby Kennedy. She was practically part of the Kennedy administration. It didn't help her. Her lack of self-confidence stemmed from childhood, and no amount of success could cure it. When she was fired from a film, no one was surprised. Her story was the one about the woman who couldn't cope with world fame. It could only have one ending. Politely, she moved aside to make way for the memories. In a powerful counterstroke against the glamour of Kennedy's America, the Soviet Union sent a man into space. He was Yuri Gagarin, and he was the only cosmonaut able to shave accurately. Gagarin's cheeks were as smooth as Kennedy's, while most of his colleagues had a blue jaw like Nixon. If Gagarin had sported the usual communist stubble, the message would have been that they couldn't build an electric shaver. Gagarin's peachy jowls sent out a signal that Soviet technology was as successful in the bathroom as on the launching pad. Kennedy's reaction to the Soviet space success was to forecast a feat beyond the dreams of Lindbergh, Destination Moon. He announced the intention of the United States to put a man on the moon within 10 years. First the new frontier, and now the final frontier. Space. The Kennedy optimism would take mankind to the stars. What could go wrong? What went wrong was that all the optimism was embodied in only one man, and that man had only one body. Everyone old enough to pronounce the word Dallas remembers what they were doing that day, or pretends he does. JFK's early death became part of everyone else's life. People got over the Lindbergh case. It happened to him. They never got over Kennedy's death. It happened to them. They took it personally. The assassination of the world-famous JFK made Lee Harvey Oswald world-famous too. There was no time to ask if that was why he did it, if he did it. The assassination of the world-famous Lee Harvey Oswald made Jack Ruby world-famous too, but only for a few days. Conspiracy theories began about Kennedy's death, Oswald's death, Ruby's death. Meanwhile, JFK's fame lived on, brighter than ever before. He mistakenly backed the Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba. He okayed a build-up in Vietnam against the CIA's advice, but the gap between the radiant film star and the fallible human being had not had time to show itself. The TV natural was an all-media immortal. In Britain, the Beatles became nationally famous and were held up as an awful warning that British youth had been corrupted by Elvis Presley. A few scattered adult voices held them up as a shining example of how British youth could now enjoy 4 homegrown Elvis Presleys with authentic regional accents. British youth said nothing because it was too busy screaming, especially the girls. The Beatles' songs were pop music of such insidious charm that even those who disapproved seemed to know the melodies and the words. The argument was really about whether young people deserved to have so much fun. Everybody had an opinion about the Beatles, and all the opinions could be summed up as a surge of pride that Britain had something of its very own to deplore, a uniquely British version of American popular music. The Beatles arrived in America to the same reaction they had already aroused in Britain. They represented what their young American fans thought of as their own unspoiled, unsouled souls. And the Beatles spoke a language they could understand, even if the accent was hard to figure out. It was the language of authenticity. The record industry might be marketing the authenticity, but couldn't manufacture it. The artist had to have it. The possibility that he might fake it obviously didn't arise in the Beatles' case. Bob Dylan was more of a problem. Though he had changed his name from Robert Zimmerman and was open to charges that no one who wrote such fluent lyrics could possibly speak in so inarticulate a manner without practicing in front of a mirror, he came over as even more authentic than the Beatles. Dylan's songs evoked a childhood of blue-collar poverty and hopping freights. Actually, he had a middle-class background, and the only freight he ever hopped was his mother's car to school. The roots he sang about going back to were long gone, but he seemed to believe that they might come again. It was a seductive message. Meanwhile, the man who started it all was marking time. Elvis Presley made 3 pot-boiler movies a year for the kind of audience that swooned with envy instead of nausea when they read about his pink Cadillac. He could have been more demanding, but he would have had to have been a different person, and Hollywood a different place. Rock stars could sing what they liked, but film stars couldn't set up their own movies. Only one star was big enough even to try. Marlon Brando, still Hollywood's #1 brooding outcast, took his revenge on the Hollywood system he hated when it starred him as Fletcher Christian in the remake of Mutiny on the Bounty. Brando did a stunning job of almost getting an upper-class English accent right, playing the role of a brooding outcast who had been to Eton. But Brando's real brilliance went to inflating the movie's budget. Once the studio was committed to the voyage and it was too late to turn back, Brando demanded endless rewrites to make Fletcher Christian's part bigger than Captain Bligh's, an impossible requirement. Nor would Brando learn his lines when they were rewritten. The words had to be taped to the ship's rail, which explains why Fletcher Christian spent so much time apparently staring overboard. Taking in less at the box office than the film cost to make, with all the distribution costs a dead loss, the studio ended up in the same shape as the Bounty, on the rocks. But the problem remained that the Bounty fiasco had made Brando more famous than ever, with still more pulling power, and that made him hard not to hire, even if he was harder still to deal with. In Britain, the Rolling Stones mounted their challenge to the establishment by rising to prominence without cleaning up their act. Unlike the Beatles, the Stones were not cute, lovable mop-tops that even parents couldn't help feeling protective about. The mere appearance of the Stones' frontman, Mick Jagger, was enough to make parents call the police. On the matter of drugs, Jagger paid no lip service to hypocrisy, despite looking as if he could pay lip service to a locomotive. The division between idealistic youth and untrustworthy age would have remained more clear-cut if the new gurus had not gone in search of old gurus of their own. The Beatles' John Lennon had already shocked those who professed to be Christians by unwisely letting slip the perfectly true observation that the Beatles were more popular than Christ. They were further shocked when the Beatles went chasing off after an Eastern mystic called the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, a hairball with a line of chat recognizable to experienced idealists of a previous generation as a perfectly standard bill of metaphysical goods. When the holy person proved to have an appetite for fame far exceeding their own, the Beatles went home disappointed. Of course, the Maharishi might never have proved disappointing if they hadn't gone to see him. Che Guevara had the advantage of remaining inaccessible. Born in Argentina, he helped Fidel Castro liberate Cuba from Batista and the Yankees. Put in charge of the new revolutionary Cuban economy, he proved his detachment from material things by running it into the ground. Prudently packed off by Fidel to help revolutionize Bolivia, he was ambushed and killed by the forces of reaction. From then on he could only be read about, and his true fame began. Che's poster was pinned on the wall of every student who believed in a new kind of political order driven by thoughts of love and peace. It was never explained how any admirer of Che could accomplish this in a fully industrialized Western country when Che himself had been unable to organize anything more complicated than a small ambush. It was never explained because the question was never asked. Che's undoubted glamour was taken to be a virtue in itself. His beret was a halo. He was a kind of non-singing rock star. An even more unlikely object of veneration for young Westerners seeking liberation was China's all-powerful ruler Mao Zedong. Near the beginning of his career as the Chinese People's Republic's supreme source of all wisdom, Mao had staged the Great Leap Forward, a master plan designed to transform China's economy. In the process, he killed more of his own people than Hitler and Stalin put together ever managed to kill of theirs. But since Mao held the monopoly of publicity, none of the blood showed. In the 1960s, Mao prepared a repeat performance of the Great Leap Forward. This time it was called the Cultural Revolution, and the main revolutionary element was composed of students who waved Mao's Little Red Book while demanding punishment for anyone who had committed the crime of growing old and set in his ways. Anyone, that is, except Mao. Mao was especially admired by French intellectuals sold on the idea that all the world's young idealists could be united in a crusade against the U.S. capitalist imperialists by a suitably sexy version of communism. In Paris, Jean-Paul Sartre did most of his marching against America. He did little of it against Russia and none at all against China. Sartre was merely the most prominent French intellectual glad to acknowledge Mao's tendencies. But Sartre did it on a world scale. For the would-be serious young everywhere, he was a guru. On campuses across the USA, students who wouldn't have been able to get past page 1 of Being and Nothingness knew his name. It was on page 1 of the newspapers. One good reason for admiring Mao's Little Red Book was that it didn't sound like John Wayne's dialogue. Helping to confuse the issue in Vietnam, Wayne made a film called The Green Berets, explaining how the Americans had come on a crusade to save a small Southeast Asian country from destruction. In reality, the crusade was somewhat compromised by the scale of destruction the Americans were causing on their own account, but Wayne wasn't concerned with reflecting reality. All the world's young liberals thought The Green Berets was the funniest movie in the world, but it was the favourite movie of young Lieutenant Calley, who became temporarily but frighteningly famous himself when he stood revealed as the instigator of the My Lai massacre. A whole village full of innocent people got wiped out by a John Wayne fan. For those who needed telling, this was compelling evidence that upright, uptight right-wing America was in serious trouble with its role models. Muhammad Ali never needed telling. He preferred to do all the talking himself. In an earlier incarnation, Muhammad Ali had been Cassius Clay, winner of the Golden Gloves and an Olympic gold medal, a world heavyweight champion of unmatched speed and grace, the latest and most electrifying example of a youngster fighting his way out of the ghetto to an unlimited future. He was young, gifted and black, a famous phrase at the time, although he could easily say better things himself. His description of his own prowess, float like a butterfly, sting like a bee, proved that whatever he lacked as a poet, it wasn't verbal inventiveness. The world warmed to him. He brightened life. But as with so many previous black celebrities, global acceptance didn't guarantee a fair shake at home. Though Cassius Clay seemed made for the American dream, his response to a whole society rigged against the black man was to join a different society altogether, Islam, hence the change of name. And his response to being drafted for Vietnam was not to go. His change of name hadn't changed his fame, which he put on the line to influence events. Vietnam wasn't Ali's war, and it wasn't Martin Luther King's war either. He had another war on his hands. Before Martin Luther King, there had already been a movement towards black civil rights in the United States. With Martin Luther King, the movement became a man. He made nonviolence a principle and put his life on the line to back it up. Any rewards he had coming for his leadership, he accepted on behalf of those he led. One of the rewards was the Nobel Prize for Peace, which for once was bestowed on someone who had unambiguously devoted his life to that very thing. King also accepted most of the danger. He was a moving target. The target grew larger when he came out against the Vietnam War. King condemned the social conditions which sent black young men to do more than their share of dying for a country in which they did less than their share of living. That made him the embodiment of the civil rights movement. It really was no surprise, least of all to King himself, when someone decided that if the body could be hit in the head, the whole thing would die. The news of King's assassination circled the earth and darkened the sky like the ash of an exploding volcano. From all over the world the cry converged on the USA. Physician, heal thyself. But who would be the physician? It wasn't going to be Lyndon Baines Johnson. The dead President Kennedy's successor had a hard act to follow. LBJ wasn't glamorous. He was an old-style wheeler-dealer, pork-barrel politico, whose modus operandi was a shoulder squeeze in a smoke-filled room reverberating to the ring of the spittoon. The facts said that he was a masterly Mr. Fix, who could back up his corn-pone rhetoric about the Great Society with a track record of liberal legislation better than Kennedy's. But Vietnam was too big to fix. The young people who ruled the world were singing, "Hey, hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today?" He had achieved anti-fame. Time to quit. He announced that he would not seek re-election for another term. Robert Kennedy offered himself for the job. He got as far as a kitchen in Los Angeles, where Sirhan Sirhan claimed his share of the dubious fame earned by Lee Harvey Oswald. Once again, the world's TV screens filled with the slow, sad spectacle of a Kennedy funeral. The American dream said that anyone could hope to be president. It didn't say that a single family could tie the job up. Richard Nixon was elected fair and square by the people to whom he gave a voice, the silent majority. For the vocal minority, which included all the youth-oriented media, he was the villain. The spotlight which had given JFK a halo but had helped to melt LBJ was shining just as hot for Nixon. Every word he said, every little gesture was marked for style and usually marked low. At best, Nixon was grudgingly admired for his tactical agility, but there was little love even from his supporters, and from his opponents, who seemed to include all the young people in the Western world. There was outright hatred from the first day he took office. In the Eastern world, in that same famous year of 1968, the Russian leader Leonid Brezhnev became as famous as he was ever going to get when he personally ordered that Czechoslovakia's bid for freedom should be flattened with tanks. The Western world's young people were ready to concede that the Soviet Union might be almost as bad as America, but they found Brezhnev harder to hate than Nixon. Lenin had been injected with formaldehyde after death. Brezhnev had apparently received the same treatment while still alive. As a villain, Brezhnev was a non-starter. Tough on the Czechs, maybe, but strictly a zombie. 20th century fame had always been a value-free commodity. The notion that its freedom from value might be a value in itself, that famous people inhabited a world worth more than ours, even when they were worthless, was promoted by the New York artist and style guru Andy Warhol. He first won fame for pop paintings that looked as if anyone could have painted them. He won further fame for making movies that looked as if anyone could have made them. His fame was redoubled when one of his followers shot him. Unlike Martin Luther King or the Kennedy brothers, Warhol survived. Some said because he had been so near death from drugs already that his body didn't notice the bullet. But what made Warhol lastingly famous was his announcement that in the future everyone would be famous for 15 minutes. Whether or not this was accurate as a prediction, it certainly matched the temper of the times. Look at Andy. If anyone ever looked like nobody, it was Andy Warhol. And think how far he had gone. And think how far Neil Armstrong was going. He was an American astronaut, and he was going to the moon. The same could have been said of Buzz Aldrin and Michael Collins, the other crew members of the mission. Or it could have been any other name from the whole team of astronauts on the project. They were all the same man, with slightly different wives. But Armstrong was held to possess the right qualities of utter dependability and dedication. He did his best to rise to the historic moment. He prepared a line which he would say when he stepped onto the moon's surface. That's one small step for a man, one giant step for mankind. He blew the line. He said man instead of a man. Since man and mankind are the same thing, what he said was strictly meaningless. But it didn't really matter what he said. Armstrong could have said something else. He could have been someone else, and the result would have been the same. He was world famous without having emerged from obscurity. In the quarter of a century since World War II, America's position as the world's dominant cultural power had grown beyond challenge. Could the Russians produce an Elvis Presley? Where was the Chinese Frank Sinatra? No, America decided who became world famous, and the most famous American, the President, was the focus of the whole world's attention. Even when he played with a yo-yo, was seen in public with Spiro Agnew, or turned out to have two close friends called Bebe Rebozo and Bob Ablanalp. President Nixon was short on style. Still painfully aware that Jack Kennedy's charm was not among his own attributes, Nixon admitted that he lacked charisma, but his notorious tricksiness turned into fame for being hard to fool. Nixon wouldn't do anything stupid out of misplaced romanticism. The heavy had become the leading man. The leading man took on a sidekick, Henry Kissinger. Kissinger was Nixon's roving troubleshooter on foreign policy. He had a foreign accent to match. Kissinger never learned to speak like an American because he never listened. He was a bright man who always knew best, but he had one weakness. He simply loved being famous because it made tall women love him. Here was the century's clearest proof that fame really must be an aphrodisiac. With Kissinger to advise him, Nixon turned the world stage from a metaphor into a fact. He actually went to China instead of just sending messages. By being there, he identified American worldwide influence with himself. Go anywhere, do anything. He went to Moscow and did the same thing again. Nixon was making it look like America's world. Somewhere back there behind the Kremlin, Brezhnev had a secret collection of American cars. Nixon wasn't collecting Russian ones. He was there to prove that he had the moral edge, the historic stature. Vietnam looked like the only thing Nixon couldn't fix with a personal appearance. For young people at home and abroad, the war was his fault. Some of the more reprehensible aspects of it undoubtedly were. Nixon and Kissinger conspired to bomb Cambodia without Congress finding out. It was illegal, and when the news leaked, many Americans of good heart began to despair of their system of government. Jane Fonda was a famous young film star from a family of film stars. She was admired by all for trying to make intelligent films. She got a more mixed reception when she tried to make political points. First, she came out against the Vietnam War. Then she risked her career by going to Hanoi as a gesture of protest at her own country's aggressive policy and agreeing to pose on an anti-aircraft gun otherwise employed to shoot down American bombers. Staking her fame on a point of principle made Fonda more famous than ever, but she came home with no guarantee that she would ever be allowed to star in films again. If Nixon had had his way, she wouldn't have. Behind the scenes, he set the tax authorities to harass famous enemies, while up front he was glad-handing his famous friends. One of them was Frank Sinatra, who had switched allegiances after the Kennedys shut him out. They let it be known that they were worried about the bad publicity attached to his alleged mafia connections. Since it was not unknown that JFK had shared a mistress with a mobster, Sinatra had a right to feel hard done by. It looked as if Nixon and his buddy Henry could handle anything. The silent majority knew that if the only way out of Vietnam was to do a deal, then Dick and Henry would be the ones to do it. Nixon had proved that he was the one with staying power. When the going gets tough, the tough get going. It was his favorite saying. Patton was his favorite movie. But all the media attention that made it look as if Mr. Fix wasn't so bad after all couldn't be turned off when it transpired that a private commando group financed by CREEP, the committee to re-elect him, had broken into the Watergate complex in Washington with the intention of bugging Democratic Party headquarters. Weather-beaten political observers who knew that presidents had always done unsavory things were stunned only because Nixon hadn't needed to do something so risky. He was going to win anyway. But for young idealists everywhere, Watergate was heaven sent. The villain who had been threatening to turn into a tough guy hero was back to being a villain again, and this time he was double-dyed. Nixon had disgraced himself and desecrated the presidency. He brought fame itself into doubt. A world of skeptics had been created, who from now on would always wonder about the real story behind the aura. The sneaking suspicion that Mother Teresa might really be after a recording contract started with Nixon. Vietnam was just a lost war. When Nixon left the White House, it was a lost world. No American official above the rank of dog catcher would ever be fully trusted again. After Watergate, the American public was ready for a heartwarming movie that showed family values at work, even if the family were gangsters. The Godfather was made before the crisis burst, but could now be seen in its full significance. All of Marlon Brando's old fame, plus a slice more, returned when he played Don Corleone. Brando, as the all-seeing, all-wise head mobster, was a fantasy that the worldwide audience wished was real. An American president who knew what was going on, did not screw up, and would have been able to burgle Democratic Party headquarters without getting caught. Off-screen, however, Brando was not the man in charge. He was just a famous actor, and he was more trouble than he was worth. Nobody much minded the way he used his fame to make a fuss about the American Indians. After all, it wasn't as bad as Jane Fonda making a fuss about the North Vietnamese. But Brando didn't just use his power to fight the government. He used it to fight Hollywood. It had got to the point where nobody would bankroll a movie with him as the star. There was a nagging fear that he might eat the budget. As Brando's girth grew huge, he left a vacuum into which a new generation of screen stars was eager to expand. They didn't let the system run them. They ran it. The press called them superstars. In the trade, they were called gorillas. The most engaging gorilla was Jack Nicholson. After a long apprenticeship in obscurity, he had become famous in the late 60s in Easy Rider, playing the skeptical lawyer who was too smart for the system. In the 70s, he played the same part on screen and off. Even in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, when he was supposed to be a madman, he was a sane madman. It was the system that was insane. The only hope was to live by your own rules. Nicholson did this off-screen as well as on. He said and did what he felt like. He also ate what he felt like, and did nothing about his thinning hair except sketch in a bit of extra darkness with an eyebrow pencil. Nicholson's core audience was the original youth culture growing older along with him. He was their proof that a first-generation Rolling Stone reader could make millions of dollars and still not lose touch with his Grateful Dead albums. Warren Beatty was another gorilla who made his own rules. On screen, his appeal consisted mainly of an improbably handsome face and a touching conviction that if he spent a long time searching for a word, it added up to drama. But off-screen, he built up a reputation rivaling Errol Flynn's for his prowess as a seducer. He did this mainly by spending a long time searching for a word, while current, ex, and would-be girlfriends revealed all to the press. He also took a long time searching for the right films, which were hardly ever as successful as his publicity. No star talked less, and no star was more talked about. It was uncannily good career management, and it was all his idea. Warren was in business for himself. Of all the gorillas, Clint Eastwood did the most thorough job of starting his own branch of the film business and running it on corporate lines. Before Watergate, he starred in a string of westerns playing a mysterious bounty hunter who said virtually nothing while the music did all the talking. After Watergate, Eastwood continued with the westerns, but shifted his main marketing emphasis to an alternative line of product, featuring himself as a cop fighting a lone battle against crime, his own police department, and the strange reluctance of soft-bellied liberals to put the bad guys away for good. His co-star was the biggest gun not mounted on a battleship. Eastwood had magnum force, his fame. Hollywood was a den of thieves, but he had it beaten. He set up his own movies, took his cut up front, owned a percentage of the gross, and employed all the people who had once been employing him. Robert De Niro had even more guns than Clint Eastwood. In Taxi Driver, De Niro was a one-man arsenal and as mad as a hatter. He studied taxi driving and madness in order to play the role. When he had to play Jake LaMotta, a boxer who got fat, De Niro put on 50 pounds, something not even Marlon Brando had done deliberately. De Niro changed himself so completely for each role that the public had trouble remembering what he looked like. But everyone knew his name. He was Hollywood's first choice of star for any role meant to portray the psychosis, squalor, and generally irredeemable sleaze of life in America. The most unlikely gorilla was Robert Redford, because he was boyishly clean-cut and innocent in the old teen movie manner. But now that almost every starring role was about a man alone against corruption and hypocrisy, not even Redford could get away with being a conventional hero on the side of the law. Reprising the 60s hit Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, the story of a couple of lovable outlaws, Redford and Paul Newman had a huge 70s hit with The Sting, the story of a couple of lovable con men. Redford was so famous that any movie he wanted to make got made. He and the other gorillas had the movie business tied up. In Redford's case, power never looked more pure. His teeth were so friendly. But power was what it was, the power of fame.